everyone, welcome to the new video. So today we are here in day 5 of Terraform tutorial series, and today we'll see about data sources and dependencies. So without further ado, let's go.
In day 4, we understood about Terraform state file, how to store it locally, how to store it remotely, how to maintain state locking and consistency, and how to inspect the state. Today, we'll see about data sources and dependencies. Like using data source, how we can fetch the existing VPC ID from AWS. So, what we mean by existing VPC ID, and why we are using data source, then what are dependencies, and if we have to define any dependency of any resource, then how to do it in Terraform. So that we'll see today. In this way we'll are able to understand that how to connect to Terraform resources with external data. So what we mean by data sources, suppose what we mean by data sources, suppose there is one there is one resource which is already created manually on cloud. Suppose there is a VPC, virtual uh, private cloud. So AWS, what is VPC now? I'll tell you first. uh, AWS or Azure, these all are a global or public cloud. So whenever we public cloud means everybody can access the resources created on the cloud. But if anybody who wants that those resources should not be visible to anybody else, or they should have their virtual private cloud. It's a virtual, but there is a range that they define, and the the cloud will be theirs, and whatever resources they are going to create, they are going to create inside that VPC. So this is one of the resource. So suppose we already created a virtual private cloud inside which we are going to create a EC2 or a VM we want to create, and now VPC was created uh, not by our Terraform code, but it was created by manually. And now we want to create EC2 instance by Terraform code. So in this case, when VPC is already created and we want to use that same VPC data, but it was not created by our Terraform code, so we don't have any data about it in our script. So whatever we create, we have a script for it. But because this VPC was not created and we are not managing it, so we don't have any data. In order to use the information of the existing data which was not created by us, we will be using data source, so that whatever was created not via Terraform script, we can use the data of that resource, and we can inside that we can create our resources. So this is what we mean by data source, to connect to the data which was not created by our Terraform script. So there this repo is there, and I'll show that how we can suppose. So we want to use, so inside, before creating any EC2 instance, we need to create a VPC, or if VPC is already there, we need to give a VPC ID. Or if you are not giving a VPC ID, the instance will get created, or anything that will get created in a default VPC. Okay. So if you're not giving any VPC ID, then it will get created in a default VPC. So here this VPC is already uh, created and we used to use the data, we want to use its data, so we need to, instead of resource, generally we, whatever we are creating through our Terraform script, we refer it through resource, but this is not what we have created through Terraform, so we refer it through data of AWS, and this is the name of that VPC. Just for referring it in our script, this is the name we'll give. The filter, or the tags, the names or values we want to give, we'll give it. Then in resource, then whatever resource we are going to create, we have to give the VPC ID. We are creating the AWS subnet. So subnet is again the range. It is like a netting, subnetting inside a virtual private cloud, that these will be the IP addresses um, available. So like this, the SCIDR block we assign. So that's why subnetting is done in VPC ID also. So that's why we need to give. So AWS subnet is also one of the AWS resource. So AWS subnet, we have given the example, and the VPC ID that we will use is data.awsvpc.existing vpc.id. This is because we are just using the ID, so that's why data.aws hyphen underscore vpc dot existing underscore vpc dot id and the CID. So this is how uh, we'll give whatever data we'll use. If we didn't have the access to it earlier, we'll use it like this. So this is what we mean by uh, data sources. Next thing, what we have to see, the implicit and explicit dependencies. So what we mean by implicit dependencies means if any resource is dependent on another resource. Implicit dependency means that if we haven't defined any dependency anywhere, but it is like that our Terraform script will understand that the resource is dependent on that resource. Suppose we haven't defined that AWS subnet is dependent on AWS VPC. Dependent means that this resource should be created first and this resource should be created after the VPC. Because why? Because we are using the VPC ID, which can only we will get once this resource will get created, and that only VPC ID we will use. We haven't defined any dependency anywhere. It's just that uh, we can the Terraform will analyze itself that dependency means this resource can only be created once this resource is created. After VPC is created, my VPC, then only the resource AWS subnet can be created, because we are referring the ID of this VPC here. So resource CIDR block, and then in this CIDR block we are using this much in AWS subnet. So this is how Terraform will understand. Now, what is there is another kind of dependency, which is explicit dependency, that we define. In this dependency, what we do, we define explicitly that this resource is dependent on the other resource. We define that AWS IAM role is something like when you give permission to any resource, that they can access it, they can list it, they can delete it, they can post some data. So first up, role is created, policy is created, and policies can be assigned to group. So a role is some kind of name that we give to that this role will have list, get, put actions this role can do, and that role get assigned uh, you know uh, either you can assign the role or you create a policy and attach it to group. So like this we do. So this is kind of it is related to access management of resources. So IAM role, policy, everything is related to access in AWS. I'm trying to make you understand little bit AWS things too side by side, but it's not very clear, but little bit understanding I'm giving. So before attaching the role to anything, first of all, policy should be created. Okay, before attaching the role to a policy, that role attachment to a policy will only be done until unless policy is not there. So that's why we have defined explicitly that it depends on AWS IAM policy dot my policy. So this is how what I mean by implicit and explicit dependency. So depends on usage. What are implicit and explicit dependencies? We saw here that how to define depends on in resource block only. We will define depends on with a square bracket. Inside the square bracket, we'll give the resource name. Where on what resource it is dependent. So I hope things are clear to you, and that's all for today's tutorial video.
That's all for today's video. I hope it's helpful. Please let me know your views in the comment section. Till then, take care. Bye.